Pass the carrots, please.
May I be excused, please? Yes, dear.
How did children entertain themselves back in the 1950s? In the US, comics attracted millions with shocking stories. Popular titles like Tales from the Crypt and crime suspense stories were packed with graphic violence, gore, and dark moral lessons. Villains buried axes into victims' skulls, corpses clawed their way out of graves, and innocent characters met gruesome ends in tales of betrayal and revenge. Sexual themes simmered beneath the surface, scantily clad women implying sexual deviance.
The comic book censorship movement of the 50s illustrates the conflict between protecting children from perceived harm and society's responsibility to preserve free expression. It examines the government's role in balancing child protection with the rights of parents to regulate their children's exposure. The movement also raises questions about low-value speech, the First Amendment rights of comic creators, and children's rights to engage with subversive content.
Duck or swim.
To set the scene, the 1950s was marked by an idealized vision of suburban life of a nuclear family made possible by the post-World War II economic boom, often symbolized by the white picket fence.
There was a box for everyone, and it was pretty tight. There wasn't a lot of room to move in. There was a box if you were a woman. There was a box if you were a man. There was a box if you were a teenager and a child.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Yup. And cover.
Additionally, the Red Scare initiated widespread censorship when Senator McCarthy led investigations into communist influences. Libraries removed books deemed too liberal. Newspapers spreading communist views like the Daily Worker were banned. Such censorship paved the way for psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wertham's crusade against comics.
So, what happened when comics began to take hold in youth culture? Concerns about juvenile delinquency began when the number of arrests of minors rose by 45% in 2 years. One notable case was Jack Coleslaw, a young serial killer. He claimed he was addicted to horror comics. Wortham cited multiple cases of comic-inspired juvenile crime. The resulting panic from parents, educators, and religious organizations led to the Senate subcommittee meeting. Although 27 bills aiming to censor comics were deemed unconstitutional, the public panic caused the comic industry to self-censor by creating the Comics Code Authority, a governing body that approved all comics before publication.
The government was the first caught between rights and responsibilities. The principle in loco parentis states that the government has the responsibility to intervene in the lives of minors for their welfare, such as censoring media that could desensitize them to violence or distort their psychological development. People claim that even short-term effects of reading horror comics such as nightmares, fear, or anxiety justify censorship.
Tell me about how they scare you.
I dreamt that this Martian from Mars came after me, and I woke up with that.
Mm-hmm. And this was after you'd read one of these horror comics, huh?
There was already a precedent for protecting children's minds. In 1918, the compulsory education laws expanded the government's role in moral education, and in the 1930s, the Federal Communications Commission began regulating broadcast content and added child-focused programming. When the Senate declared youth crime a national emergency, the government had a compelling interest to restrict harmful publications.
Some believe that the calls for government intervention were designed to remove the responsibility to protect children from parents' shoulders. In his book Seduction of the Innocent, Dr. Wertham claimed the government alone is responsible for shielding minors because parents lack the understanding and resources. Comics were cheap enough that many children could buy them with their own money, without needing parental approval. He argued laws protecting children's minds were as reasonable and necessary as those protecting their bodies, like the Pure Food and Drug Act. Comics were always treated with suspicion, but when Wertham gave parents the opportunity to blame their children's misbehavior on comics instead of taking responsibility themselves, comics became the perfect scapegoat.
Ultimately, much of Wortham's evidence of harm was subjective. For example, Batman was perceived as homosexual, so Wortham claimed he encouraged homosexual behavior in boys, which he believed was harmful.
But the government tasked with creating laws to protect children has a responsibility to ensure that these laws are grounded in verifiable evidence, not prejudice. Carol Tilly argued that Wortham cherry-picked the most violent comics he could find to show as examples. The so-called comic-inspired crimes were committed by children already deeply disturbed. In retrospect, the rising crime rates that seemed to coincide with the sales of comics are better explained by family disruption during World War II. Police began paying more attention to teenagers, pursuing them as suspects in crime more frequently, none of which had anything to do with comics.
Furthermore, the government has no right to censor, quote, low-value speech, or speech seen as morally corrupting without societal worth. Before landmark cases such as Miller v. California, the distinction between low-value speech and speech not protected by the First Amendment remained poor because low-value speech is subjective. Wortham compared comic books and novels, claiming that novels are more mature and intellectual, but comics were trash and glorified perversions, but these are subjective terms. The code itself exhibits the subjectivity of low-value speech, sanitizing stories to conform to white picket fence values. For example, the code reduced the Joker from a deeply layered character in Detective Stories 27 to a one-dimensional villain in Batman 92. The government does not have the right to restrict low-value speech as, quote, what is one man's amusement could teach another's doctrine.
However, comic creators also have rights. As artists, they are protected by the First Amendment. EC Comics publisher William Gaines argued that external pressures to conform to moral standards were stifling their artistic freedom. Stories like Crime Does Not Pay 24, which highlighted systemic corruption in law enforcement, and Vault of Horror 35, which exposed corruption within political and business elites, exemplified content at risk of censorship. Similarly, works like Harvey Kurtzman's Frontline Combat, which critiqued blind patriotism, and Will Eisner's The Spirit, which explored trauma and obsession, faced scrutiny. The First Amendment guaranteed artists the right to display society's moral ambiguities without fear of repression, but the Comics Code did not. The code was supposed to eliminate racism, but instead eliminated diversity. For example, The Whipping, a comic in which a jealous father attempts to murder his white daughter's Mexican boyfriend, but instead accidentally kills his own daughter, was banned under the pretense of being racist. It was supposed to require that respect be given to female characters, but instead increasingly relegated them to secondary domestic and romantic roles. A good example is Lois Lane, going from a brave, no-nonsense reporter to an impulsive, careless, emotional, wannabe housewife interested only in finding Superman's secret identity.
However, children have the right to be exposed to subversive content. Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development and Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development suggest that children benefit from confronting complex moral dilemmas. The Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that minors have First Amendment rights and cannot be shielded from ideas simply because they are controversial.
Crusade against comics had long-lasting effects, both locally and in the broader cultural landscape. In the short term, it severely damaged the comic book industry, forcing publishers to self-censor through the establishment of the code, which led to watered-down, sanitized content that was often seen as disconnected from the reality of social issues. This era stigmatized comics, reducing their cultural value and reinforcing the notions that they were little more than low-value entertainment for kids.
In the long term, the movement set a concerning precedent for how societal fears of new forms of expression can lead to widespread censorship, particularly with media like video games.
Let's discuss whether there is any link between violence on the screen and real violence.
Rap music.
We are allowing music, displaying of guns, violence. We're allowing it to stay on these sites.
Even rock and heavy metal before it. This reflects a pattern of generational anxiety where adult society struggles to understand it and as a result demonizes the creative expression of youth.
You have a civic and corporate responsibility.
I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today.
I want to rock.